come here, baby. Here he is. Oh, look how beautiful you are. Look at the little socks. He's got boots. He's Puss in Boots. Oh, the cutest boot you ever saw. Thank you for coming to Mama. Hello and welcome to my library. This gorgeous, beautiful Friday morning. It's actually been really chilly in Southern California lately, and so that's why I'm wearing this big jacket. I have a nail appointment in like 20 minutes, so I gotta leave right about now. But you know, that's usually when I decide to start doing things, is when I've got other things to do, which is how probably I've ended up with over 200 books on my bookshelf that I haven't read. So we need to start reading, people. And I'm on winter break right now. I thought that it would be a break where I could just read books on books on books on books, but then I got a job for the break, which now I think is gonna be an ongoing job, but it's a good job, so I'm very excited about it. Ugh, more hair. It's a constant struggle in this house. We got 3 cats. They're all fuzzy, like very fluffy cats, and so hair is everywhere all of the time. Anyways, this week I am going to get through a set of these books. I've got 4 in particular that I want to get through for this video, and I want to share them with you. And I've already read one of them, but we're gonna pretend like I haven't. We are reading Truman Capote for a week. So what do we have by Truman Capote? Well, we've got the most famous ones, I believe, In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's. I've already read In Cold Blood, so we'll do my thoughts on that one later. And then I also have Music for Chameleons and Answered Prayers. They all sound extremely interesting. In Cold Blood is a true crime. I don't want to get totally into it, but I've never read a true crime book like this one. Breakfast at Tiffany's is about Miss Holly Golightly. Very interesting. I watched some clips of the Breakfast at Tiffany's movie with Audrey Hepburn. I know I've never seen it. You know, I'm the kind of person that, like, name the most famous movie you can think of. I probably haven't seen it. And it's not because I try to avoid it. It's just because, I don't know. That's why I have a hard time keeping up with things that are, you know, relevant in pop culture, because I don't know how to explain my aversion to pop culture things. And it's not even an aversion. That's not even a good way to describe it. With all the books I've read, you'd think that I could come up with some better descriptors that describe how I feel about things, but I can't. So it's my superpower. These are the 4 books that I'm gonna be reading this week. Well, 3 books, because I've already read one of them. I live very close to LAX, so thank you. But we're gonna pretend like this book was read with these books. I don't need to tell you that. I don't need to let you in on the behind the scenes secret, but I can't help myself. I need to learn how to lie better. These are the books we're reading this week. Let's just get right into it. Okay, so I just got back from getting my nails done. Not that that's what you're watching this video for. And I was reading Breakfast at Tiffany's while I was there. But I'm not talking about Breakfast at Tiffany's first, because I need to tell you about the first Truman Capote book that I've already read and give you my thoughts on it before they escape my brain forever. No, they never will, because I do feel like this book is gonna stay with me for a while. I've never read a true crime story written quite like this, and I still feel like I wanna learn more about it, because it was written so much like a story, like a novel, not very much like a documentary style, not very much like that. You really got into the heads of the people involved, everybody from the families, and you know, you get to know them and you're introduced to them in the beginning of the story, and then you find out about this, you know, horrible massacre that occurred, and you're slowly but surely introduced to the people that did it. And by the end of the book, you don't feel sorry for them so much as you understand where they're coming from, while still knowing that what they did to this family, massacring this family, was just horrific and inexcusable. And you don't feel like you should excuse them, but you also have a sense of how these things can happen, because I think that's what the central question is at the beginning of the book, is how could this happen to this family? And what Capote answers is that question. He shows us how this could happen. And while the central story, this family, this particular town that this takes place in Kansas, is important, of course, in showing us how this could happen, it almost is like a commentary on these types of crimes in general, or just any type of crime. And it also gives you some perspective of the kind of people that we're creating when we aren't giving what we need to our young people, and when we don't support our kids, or when kids don't have family to support them. Or how about when they do have family to support them and they do come from this perfect family unit? How do those people become murderers? So I feel like this book answers a lot of those questions. And I haven't seen the movie In Cold Blood, and I think that the movie is more so about Truman Capote's journey in creating the story, because he did a lot of interviews and research, and you can see it in the book. It's like you're there while it's happening. Interesting little tidbit. It talks a lot about Olathe, Kansas. I've been to Olathe like a handful of times. I used to work at a dealership, a car dealership in Olathe, Kansas, and so I would travel there. I was living in California, but it was one of our clients, and I would travel there all the time. Really interesting little place. Lots of nice people. No vegetarian options, because at the time I was a vegetarian. But, interesting place. But anyways, that's kind of how I feel about this book. And so I started reading Breakfast at Tiffany's while I was getting my nails done today. And so different. And it's really interesting to see an author like Truman Capote. You know who his writing reminds me of is Donna Tartt. She wrote The Secret History, The Goldfinch. She also wrote The Little Friend. This book reminded me of the writing in The Little Friend, which took place in some little town, I think Missouri, Mississippi, one of those. I'll check in on that for you later and let you know. But anyways, I did like this book a lot. I would recommend you read it if you haven't already. It's a classic. And I'll let you know what I think about Breakfast at Tiffany's when I finish reading that one. So since the last time we checked in, not only did I finish Breakfast at Tiffany's, but I also just kept reading right on through, and I finished Music for Chameleons too, because they were just that good. So Breakfast at Tiffany's was a really short read, and there was also a few more stories in the back called House of Flowers, A Diamond Guitar, and A Christmas Memory. I enjoyed all of the stories in this book. And what was interesting is while I was reading Music for Chameleons, I started to get a little curious, and so I started watching some interviews with Truman Capote on YouTube, reading the comments, and I noticed somebody had commented that what they love about Capote is that he's able to write something like In Cold Blood and then write something that's totally opposite, like Breakfast at Tiffany's. But I'd have to disagree that they're totally opposite, because I actually see quite a few parallels between those two stories and a lot of his stories. I think what it is that Capote really knows how to get to the heart of a tortured soul. And I think he knows how to do this because he himself is a tortured soul. So in Cold Blood, obviously the murderers in the story are the tortured souls. While in Breakfast at Tiffany's, the main character, Holly Golightly, she's a tortured soul. At first, she seems to be this really charismatic socialite. She doesn't have a care in the world. She just kind of appears to let things roll off of her back. But in reality, all she really wants is love and security, but she doesn't really feel like she belongs anywhere. She can't really find her place. And this theme of not belonging and having a hard time finding your place seems to carry through his other stories too. For instance, in House of Flowers, we have a young girl who used to live in the mountains, and now she's been brought down to this village and she's living in a brothel, and men come from all around to see her. She's the youngest one there. Men come from far and wide to come see her and spend time with her, and she's the most beautiful one there. And she really acts like she loves the attention, that she loves being the hot commodity, so to speak. But when this young man comes down from the mountains and wants to take her away back to the mountains, where really that's home for her, she goes with him. Life isn't easy with him. Her grandmother-in-law just makes her life a living hell. The work is really hard. But when the women that she worked with at the brothel down in town come to see her and want to take her back, she doesn't want to go, because at the end of the day, even though it's hard in the mountains, and even though she's not getting all this attention and she's not able to enjoy all these fineries, at the end of the day, that's where she feels like she's at home. And so that's where she wants to stay. And then this last story in this book, called A Christmas Memory, is not only fitting for the time of year, because it is Christmas time right now, but it's also this really beautiful story of friendship between a young boy, 6 or 7 years old, and an old lady, and their tradition that they have around Christmas time. And it doesn't really have a happy ending, but I do think that it's a really beautiful story. And Truman Capote actually recorded an audio of this story of this book, and I found it on YouTube, so I will link it down in the description. And I think listening to him read this story brings a whole nother dimension to it. But you know, these two characters, they're this separate entity outside of the rest of the characters in the story. It's almost like they belong with each other, but they don't feel as if they really belong as part of the group, the family that they're living in. That was a really interesting read as well. So Music for Chameleons is supposed to be a collection of nonfiction accounts and conversations and people that Truman Capote has interacted with throughout the years, though I do suspect that some of them are fiction, and I think if you read the book, you'll see why. And normally I don't find myself reading a book cover to cover when it's just a series of non-related stories, but this was so interesting that I think I read it in like a day. It was so good. It was so chock full of interesting accounts. I just couldn't put it down. And surprisingly, when I was doing a little bit of digging and research while I was reading this book, I found that a lot of people said that this was not Truman Capote's best work. And I'm not only surprised by that, but I'm also a little excited, because so far I've read 3 of the books, but I have 4 of them. There's a lot more Capote work out there that I haven't read. So if this is not his best work, then I'm really excited to read some of his other stuff that he's put out, especially some of the shorter stories and other conversations he's had. And I think the most profound shift in perspective that I experienced while reading this book is just how worldly Capote is, and how many different types of people he came into contact with and interacted with and connected with. He did a lot of traveling, and he knew a lot of different people, everything from like famous Hollywood actors and actresses like Marilyn Monroe to all of the murderers that he interviewed throughout the years in various prisons on death row. And he developed a kind of rapport with them. Like, for instance, Perry Smith was one of the murderers in Cold Blood, and during the 5 years that he researched the book and he was doing all of these interviews with the different people that were associated with the story, he got to be pretty close to Perry Smith. And so it actually quite disturbed him when he was executed, because both him and his partner in crime were executed by hanging in Kansas. It's not a very humane way to go if, you know, you do need to take the route of capital punishment. They don't die right away. He had mentioned in some of these interviews that I watched that it was really disturbing for him to watch this person that he'd got to know over the past 5 years die in such a brutal way, even despite the fact that he knew what this person had done and why he was being executed. I also noticed that Capote likes to include bits and pieces of himself in his characters. Like, for instance, one of the common character traits I noticed in the children that he would write about is that a lot of them wanted to grow up and become a tap dancer, which I thought was kind of oddly specific. And then when I was watching interviews with Capote, he had mentioned that he himself, when he was a young boy, one of his dreams was to grow up and become a tap dancer. So there's a lot of himself that he injects even into the fictional characters. My favorite story in this book, Music for Chameleons, though, is the last one of the book, and it's called Nocturnal Turnings, or How Siamese Twins Have Sex. And luckily there's nothing graphic in it, described in it. It's just I think just a funny title that he came up with. But it's really interesting because it's literally just him having a conversation with himself. And, you know, I'm laying in bed last night reading the book and I'm laughing because the concept was so funny. And not only does he have a conversation with himself, but then he has a sub-conversation with himself. So then this one part of himself begins to pose questions to himself and he answers, and then after he goes through these series of questions, he comes back to the other part of himself that he was conversing with and he asks him, hey, are you still awake? Because he wants to get his input on what he'd just written. And I think that we all kind of do something similar to that when we're trying to make decisions and we're, you know, presented with options in life. It sounds like it would be really confusing to read something like that, but surprisingly it wasn't. And I think that's just a testament to what a great artist he was and how well he understood how to use words and dialogue. And he was really able to create these very unique aspects of the different parts of his own character. And I think a really good example of Capote's proficiency in this particular skill is if you read his recording of A Christmas Memory, you'll hear a very distinct change in cadence and inflection when he's reading as the narrator, which is a young boy. When he speaks the lines of dialogue by the old woman, you can hear the difference. You can hear that they're two different people. It's just absolutely phenomenal, and it really just, I feel like I've been missing out for a long time. I don't know why I had never read Truman Capote before, or why I'd never really looked into him much before. I just kind of heard of him, but so far, I definitely highly recommend diving more into Capote's work. And I think there's a lot more that I could say about both of these books. I just scratched the surface, but I really want to jump into my last book. It's called Answered Prayers, and it is actually an unfinished novel, but I will tell you more about that after I finish reading it. So it's a beautiful rainy week in Southern California, and I finished my last Truman Capote book, Answered Prayers, that I have in my collection. There's many more, but I haven't ventured down that journey yet. But after this book, and after this week of reading Truman Capote, I can definitively say that I am a Capote stan. And it's too bad that this novel is technically unfinished, because I wish the book was 1,000 pages long. It was so good, so artfully written, and I had to check the back multiple times and go, is this fiction? Because it reads so much like a true account of a real person. It's just, his characters are so fully developed. The writing reads like it's thoughts tumbling onto a page. It's just the easiest thing in the world to just write what you're thinking, and that's how it comes off. It's very easy, very genuine, not contrived at all. And what I love most about Capote's characters is just the fullness of them, the completeness of them. They don't feel like characters that were written just for the sake of fulfilling the role that he's given them in that story. They really feel like they exist outside of what you know about them, that there's something deeper to them, that there's some more human aspects that you know are there, but you don't know that character well enough to have discovered those parts of themselves. That's the sign of a really good artist, when they're able to create a character and not give you everything about that character, but then you still have this sense that there's something more. What's really awesome is that he uses these characters who are all very broken, but I mean, we're all broken. Nobody's perfect. So he uses these really broken characters that have these glaring character flaws, but he uses them to communicate these really profound ideas and these really profound messages. For instance, the main character in this book, Answered Prayers, which of course he's the narrator and the main character, and this particular character, like, he wouldn't ever make himself a background character in his own story, because that's the way he is. He's this very pretentious author, and he thinks he's better than he is, but he's never really had any success, so you imagine that he's probably not that good at what he does. He's not as good as he thinks he is, and he's always trying to prove to the reader that he understands these literary devices and that he knows what he's doing. So of course he would make himself the main character of his own book, and that's what it feels like you're reading. Like, the main character really wrote this story. He's the narrator that wrote this story. So anyways, his name is P.B. Jones, and there's a part in the beginning of this book where he's wondering if it's possible to love somebody if you have something to gain from him. This is what he's asking. He says, doesn't the gainful motive and the guilt accruing to it halts the progression of other emotions. And I have to wonder if that's true, because it almost makes sense. But perhaps it's just this character, P.B. Jones, rationalizing the way that he treats other people, because he's really kind of a loser, and he takes advantage of all of these people's kindnesses, and he'll just pick up and leave without even so much as a goodbye. Is what he's saying true? Or is this just a rationalization of his poor behavior? But you still have some like respect for his honesty, that he confronts this part of himself. Yet he's not a very good person. So you don't know, do you really hate him because he's morally corrupt, or do you still have some respect for him because he's willing to face this part of himself? There's actually quite a few themes and ideas in this book that I would love to explore. Like, you can see all of my stickies, and I've got notes filling this book and the other ones. And of course there's other writings of Capote's that I haven't read yet that I would just love to dissect. Like, there's one idea in here where he talks about how a factual recounting of real events can seem less believable than an altered account or the illusion. The illusion is more believable than the truth. And I think that happens sometimes in life, right? We say truth is stranger than fiction. So he addresses these different kinds of themes in really interesting ways and unexpected ways. There are also some other scandalous themes that he talks about that I think is probably outside of the scope of this video, but I would be happy to dive into more of his ideas and, you know, how I interpret them. And if you guys would be interested in seeing something like that, then definitely leave a comment letting me know down below. Before this week started, I had never read any of Truman Capote. I had never read any of Truman Capote's writing, and now I've read 4 of his books. So what do I think? I think that he was a rightly celebrated author, and I think that he was so good at what he did because he confronted some very vulnerable aspects of his character that I think for most people would be like really uncomfortable or impossible without some very expensive therapy for the average person to face. But for him, I mean, it came at a cost. Capote died of a drug overdose on August 25th, 1984. He was at the house of Joanne Carson, who was Johnny Carson's 4th wife, because of course, Capote knew anyone that was anyone, and he lived a rock star's life, and he died a rock star's death. The impression that I had of Capote before I started reading his work and started watching some of his interviews this week was that he was kind of this like nerdy little writer man that talked kind of funny, and he was kind of quiet. Well, now I know that I just could not have been further from the mark, because the truth was he was at every party. He was extremely clever. He was extremely witty. He knew all of the famous stars and Hollywood starlets and, you know, producers and anybody who is anybody. Truman Capote was friends with them, and he partied with them. He went on a lot of talk shows. He loved to show off his talent of telling a really compelling story, and as he should. It's phenomenal to watch him talk and to see how he holds the attention of the room, because he's just so good at what he did, and I think that we are also lucky to have been able to enjoy the fruits of his labor. You know, with people like him, he came from a hard life. He really overcame all the odds to be the successful writer that he became. And, you know, but it's hard to say that you wish his life had turned out differently, because I think that the reality is that so much of his genius sprung from his life the way that it was. There's a trade-off, I guess, but I mean, I'm happy that we have the work that we do from him. So I'm definitely going to be purchasing more of his work for my collection. I want to learn a lot more about Capote. I want to read more of his work. I mean, I don't even think that what I have in front of me is just a fraction of it. I know that there's some other novels that he released that did really well that I do not yet have in my collection. So if you have any Capote recommendations or anything that you feel like really spoke to you in his work, then please leave a comment down below and let me know. But with that being said, I give Truman Capote 5 out of 5 books on the boring book club scale. You're welcome, Mr. Capote. I knew it's all you ever wanted was Michelle's approval on Boring Book Club. You're welcome. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up so that other people can find this book club and we can all talk about books together. Subscribe if you want to see when I put out a new video. I'm going to be doing lots more book hauls, book reviews, artist reviews. Artists? Yeah, I mean, I would say that authors are artists. It's a certain kind of art to be a good author. And, you know, of course, continuing on with a discussion of all the Federalist Papers and my deep love of history. So if you want to be a part of all of that, subscribe to the channel. I also am going to leave the links to my social medias down below for Instagram and for Twitter. With that, I'll see you next time. Bye.